Hey guys, thanks for coming. I wasn't too sure how popular a talk on journalism was going to be at a hacking conference, so hopefully there's going to be some overlap. There actually is quite a bit of overlap, I think, at least among the journalists I know, and like the open data, open government, open source communities. So I'll try to kind of stay in the middle of like a Venn diagram of like journalism and kind of just like open source development and stuff. So this is the only slide that is conveniently in Latin, both English letters and Cyrillic letters. The rest of the slides aren't, sorry. But I work for a project called MisinfoCon. MisinfoCon is a collaboration between mainly a collaboration between two large groups. The first one is Hacks Hackers, and I am a hack, so I am part of the Hacks Hackers group. The name kind of didn't scale with the organization, but the name Hacks Hackers is supposed to be a joke. It's like a hack is like a kind of insulting word for a writer. So I'm a hack, and then the hackers are the technologists. So Hacks Hackers is a global nonprofit. I think we've got like 110 individual groups at this point. I don't know how to do that. We've got like over 100 individual groups at this point. If you go to the website, I was just trying to go to the website, but I realized I don't know how to do that with the presentation system we've got set up. I think the nearest one to here is Vienna. There's one in Vienna, there's one in Prague, there's one in Berlin. There actually isn't really a Hacks Hackers chapter in the Balkans or in Eastern Europe. So if anyone wants to start that, you should go ahead and do it. Hacks Hackers organizes meetups. They organize like really large ones. Actually, there's a really big one going on in Buenos Aires, Argentina right now. And they also organize a lot smaller kind of local meetups that bring together journalists and technologists who want to like develop tools for journalism or just come up with innovative ways to like keep journalism alive and thriving, all sorts of stuff. The other half of MisinfoCon is Mozilla. I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with Mozilla already. So they're the makers of Firefox. When I speak at journalism conferences, usually if anyone has heard of Mozilla at all, they've only know them as like the first half of Mozilla Firefox. But Mozilla is a worldwide foundation that focuses on making a better open web. So, I mean, if you're not, if you're only vaguely familiar with them, I mean, they do a lot involved in making the web, like making people more familiar with how the web works and how to make stuff for the web and how to make it transparent and communicative and just kind of thriving like that. So MisinfoCon, as its name might suggest, was originally a conference. We did the first one at MIT several months ago in the US. There's actually a second one coming up that's going to be at MozFest, which is the Mozilla Festival, like the Open Web Festival. So if anybody's going to that, that's in London. It's coming up pretty soon, actually. There's, I think the whole day before MozFest starts, there's going to be another MisinfoCon. And so what the first one was I think it was like a weekend. It was several days, and it was like the Hacks Hackers events that I was just talking about. So there were a lot of technologists, there were a lot of like app developers, startup founders, there were a lot of journalists, academics, sociologists, I don't know, all sorts of people. And it just brought together everybody who is interested in this problem of misinformation that has been growing. Oh, no. Okay. Thought I had a slide there, but I don't. So misinformation, is not like a new problem in the sense that it's newly existent. Obviously, there's always been lies. There have always been false claims. There have always been, twisted truths and things like that. But we do know, and it has been documented, that misinformation has really kind of ballooned lately. The obvious reason for that is the internet. Obviously, the internet is good for a lot of things, but it does also make it extremely easy for people to put out really damaging, disruptive content out there. And we're going to talk about later how to judge that content. In fact, what a lot of people are trying to do, in fact, most people, I think, are they're trying to step back from judging content, period. Because it's really hard to say, like, well, your content, like that blog post you put out is false, and so therefore it shouldn't be on the internet. Like, I don't think anybody, at least anybody in this room, is really in favor of like certain people being arbiters of what gets to be out on the web and what doesn't. So we're going to talk about the tangles and the issues wrapped up in that. Unfortunately, at this moment, we have a lot more problems than we have solutions, at least in the journalism world. Certainly among journalists, misinformation, has always been an issue. It's always been one of the main jobs of journalists to debunk it. But certainly people are really, really interested right now for reasons we will get into. So like I said, MisInfoCon was a conference. There's another one coming up. I edit the website. Yes, the website where we publish like articles and blog posts and essays and stuff. If you are interested in this issue, like if you have a project you're working on, or even that you would like to work on, or if you even just have like thoughts, or you feel like something you want to share with people, you should get in touch with me. The next post that I'm going to post on the website is a startup that tracks like Twitter data, I think, and he came up with a way to try to identify quote unquote fake news by identifying by who shares it and whether those users who shared it are fake accounts, as in there's no actual human behind them. So we're going to talk about some of the MisInfoCon projects later on, but I want to say again, if anyone's interested, you should come up and talk to me. I've got my contact info at the end of this presentation, and we pay $100 US, and you don't have to be from the US or anything, but we do pay, so you're not just working for free. Besides that, MisInfoCon also offers small grants. Up to the maximum is $1,000 US. Again, you do not have to be a US project at all. It's just that our accountant is in the US, so it's in dollars. But if you have a project you'd like to work on, or something that's in beta, or even like an experiment or something, Mozilla and Hacks Hackers are kind of footing the bill for just some cool experimentation. So again, come talk to me if you would like. So the Mozilla arm that's involved in MisInfoCon is the Mozilla Information Trust Initiative. So one of the things I'm dealing with in this presentation, and also that kind of everybody's dealing with on a larger scale, is what I said earlier. Like, how do you judge, I hate this phrase fake news, but I'm going to end up using this phrase fake news. Like, how do you judge it? How do you find it? How do you kind of reconcile like free speech and openness with like trying to keep certain content or certain users in check, sort of? So Mozilla's thinking is that misinformation, which, by the way, misinformation is designed as information that is untrue, while disinformation with a D is considered information that is intentionally untrue. So like if somebody puts out like propaganda and they know it's false, but they're trying to trick people into thinking it's true, that's spreading disinformation. And at MisInfoCon, we use the phrase misinformation because it's just more of like an umbrella term. But nevertheless, misinformation, at least according to Mozilla, is bad for the web because it infringes on web literacy. It's bad for transparency, for everyone's participation, and then censorship, like I was talking about earlier. So Mozilla has the end goal of making like a better web for everybody. And and obviously there's a lot of different ideas about what form that is and what issue it's taking and so on. They just started publishing something called the Internet Health Report. I don't know if anyone saw that. I think the first edition of it just came out either late last year or earlier this year. So it is something they just kind of started up. I think they just started working on it like a year or two, but it's something they'll be putting out every year from now on. And one of the primary or the most popular issues that people suggested for this health report was that misinformation was damaging to an open web for the reasons listed over there. So the MITI, the Mozilla Information Trust Institute, focuses on 4 areas. I don't really need to go into it. I probably won't. But a lot of this involves, work like research and product development and stuff, but also kind of work in real life, like not on a computer or on the web. So building communities, like bringing people together and establishing groups, and then also web literacy. They're trying to teach people kind of in real life to deal with misinformation and things like that. Again, we'll get into all this later. I'm trying to give kind of a broad overview. So the Knight Prototype Fund, this is the last big umbrella project I'm going to talk about. The Knight Prototype Fund is kind of like MisinfoCon, but a lot bigger. They offer 50,000 US dollar grants to people developing prototypes. The Knight Foundation, I don't know if everyone's familiar with them, but they're a huge organization and they give out a lot of money. The Knight Prototype Fund is just one option of all the grants they give. But they gave $1 million total last year for projects on misinformation. So pretty much along the same lines as MisinfoCon, but kind of bigger. And again, you do not have to be from the US to get these grants, although just to kind of give you fair warning, I think they do kind of give priority to US projects. MisinfoCon does not, but I don't know why that is, but someone at Knight told me that they do. But you should still totally apply. And it needs to be open source, not proprietary. By the way, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. So these slides, I tweeted them at the conference hashtag. If anyone wants to actually click on these links and follow up on this stuff, you can get these slides on Twitter, or I'll put it on my website if you want to Google me later or something. Yeah, so if you do want to follow up on this, you can get it on Twitter, or just find me, obviously. So the Knight Prototype grant winners, like I said, the open web and open source does interact with journalism quite a bit. Literally just off the top of my head, I tried to think of journalism projects that had won Knight grants, and these are a few of them. They're kind of journalism focused. I don't know if anyone's familiar with these, but if anyone is kind of interested in helping out journalists, there's a lot of overlap in maintaining kind of free societies and fighting against censorship and getting open data and transparency. I work a lot with civic data organizations in the US, and we have almost identical goals almost all the time. I hang out with them. So, all right. So this is a graph I got from a researcher in the US. Unfortunately, I asked him, I'm guessing these months are 2016. I asked him what year it was, and he didn't get back to me yet, so sorry, but we'll kind of assume it's 2016. So he did some research where he scraped Facebook groups where he believed that Macedonian and other individuals had been posting what I guess people would call fake news. They were posting either twisted, misleading information or outright false information, or some other variation. And so he scraped it using a script from Tom Levine, by the way. Shout out to Tom, who's sitting over here. Sorry. So he scraped these Facebook groups, and then he researched them by hand. So this, when you look at that Macedonian line, I don't think Tom's script had a way to identify them as Macedonian. So he was just looking these things up by hand. But this is what he found. for this one Facebook group. I think it was like it was either Bernie Sanders or Trump. And obviously you can see the Macedonian bloggers were kind of taking off. So, sorry, I'm kind of skipping around, I know. So the researcher I talked to, I don't know if this is like the official phrase, but he called these things dumpster fire blogs. That's definitely an internet phrase if there ever was one. And these are what they were going for. So I think it's important to understand, where these people, like web developers or whoever in Macedonia, like what were they even trying to do? Because I think it's been established that they weren't trying to get Donald Trump elected. Like they didn't really care. They were going primarily for ad revenue. And in order to support that, they were going for engagement. And in order to support that, they were going for content. So this is why you see that like crazy line going up while the other lines, obviously don't go up as much. So the other lines, I can't totally assume, but they're things that they're content that people put a little more thought into. The Macedonian posters were often just copying and pasting from other sites. So they would, in order to avoid getting caught, they might copy and paste from several sites, but they would just stitch together a bunch of things, make it resemble English, and then just post it. But they're very good at getting it shared. They're very good at achieving engagement. So you can see the bottom tier of what they were going for is pretty easy. The engagement they were especially good at, and then it helped them achieve ad revenue. The problem, and the kind of one of the first problems journalists face, is that journalists would love to do that. I mean, journalists would love to like make a ton of money off Google ads and like have a ton of engagement and stuff, but they totally fall behind compared to these guys. A few of the reasons for that are kind of like psychological or philosophical, like confirmation bias, or people just share what they want to read and not what they, think people should read. But I think if we want to just keep very grounded, these Macedonian posters had almost no startup costs or overhead costs, because like I said, it was just like, oftentimes literally like a high school student who would like go home from school and like copy and paste stuff and then make money off of ads. And that is not journalism. A journalist who would publish maybe the same content in the sense of like the same amount of words or whatever, I mean, they're usually paid for one thing and paid like an American actual professional salary. And then they also need an editor to check that, and they need a copy editor to check the grammar, and then they need a publisher to publish it, and they need a CMS to host it, and all sorts of stuff. And so there's way more cost associated with actual journalism than there is with these dumpster fire blogs. So the thing that journalists are most worried about is fabricated content. I actually borrowed this from another website called First Draft News. That is... It's like a news startup, I guess, but it's an organization kind of dedicated to discovering how journalists like develop news. Like if there's a breaking story, like what's the first fact that goes out, and then how do they build on it, and so on. So anyway, so First Draft News put together this graphic that I thought was pretty good. So if you read it left to right, at least the person who put this together found this like kind of least concerning to most concerning, according to journalists. So all the way to the right, you see fabricated content, and that is far and away what journalists are most worried about when we talk about quote unquote fake news. So at least for myself, as someone who actually works as a journalist with other journalists, I mean, people are kind of freaking out about it. And this is what they have in mind. So like that story that says Donald Trump was endorsed by the Pope, that was 100% made up. According to Facebook, it was also the most shared story on their platform in 2016. And it is 100% made up. Never happened, never even came close to happening. So that's obviously pretty worrisome, at least for journalists, because journalists consider outright fake or false information to be like their arch enemy. Like if you're a working journalist and you fabricate something, for example, you're like blacklisted from the profession. You would never get a job in journalism for your entire life. Other things, like if you look at the second story, there were lots of stories saying like Hillary Clinton is probably going to prison or something. That one at least has a chance of being true. Hillary Clinton last year did have a chance of going to prison. It was not impossible for her to go to prison, but it was very unlikely. So this second option is, this would be misleading content probably. Yeah, so if you see second from the left, misleading. Journalists deal with that one quite a bit more because politicians will always tell you like, oh, this bridge is like definitely going to get funded, and then it like may or may not get funded. But that's different from just 100% making something up. So when journalists are worried about this misinformation problem, this is what they're worried about. I titled this slide "The Journalist Threat Model," based on a talk that Quinn Norton gave like a year or two ago. Quinn Norton is a journalist herself. She wrote this big story on Anonymous. That's kind of what she's famous for. And she's a hacker herself as well. And so she gave this talk about threat modeling, mostly in the context of the usual threat modeling where you're trying to protect yourself against attacks and stuff. But something that stood out to me from her talk is that everybody does their own threat modeling. So journalists have a different way of kind of viewing their enemy, so to speak, and subsequently protecting themselves against it. And then other groups do as well. So if we look at these dumpster fire blogs, this is what they're going for. So they obviously have different threat modeling. They're trying to not get caught by Google, for example. If Google did catch them plagiarizing other content, then they wouldn't get any more ads. And something else that's interesting about these guys is that the missions listed here are almost identical to the missions that a social platform would have, like Facebook. Facebook wants ad revenue. It also wants your data. I guess that's not up there. But it really wants engagement and it really wants content. So I think a lot of journalists are kind of spinning their wheels and freaking out because they're thinking about this Pope story and how like society is going to hell because people believe this totally fake story. But I think they don't realize that they're using a different threat model than basically everybody else. A lot of times when social platforms are trying to deal with this issue, they really only deal with like spam or bots, and they're not necessarily interested in differentiating between false information, as in information that's completely untrue, and then other information, like info that's like twisted or info that's, just kind of like crappy, like spam or something. So we're going to talk about how kind of attempts to differentiate those and then whether or not we even should. And then at the bottom tier here, the things, I just kind of listed everything else at the bottom of those two. Journalists have always dealt with misinformation since the beginning of journalism. So things like manipulated content or misleading claims and stuff like that, that's, I think, not as worrisome for journalists just because they just deal with that all the time. Whereas this issue of the fabricated info gaining a really, really serious foothold, that is new. And it's new thanks to social platforms far and away because of these goals. So how do you differentiate them? Okay, so pretty much the only way to differentiate actual false information from just kind of like shitty information is you need human beings. Like fact checking is kind of your only option. If anyone has another option, feel free to like share it. But you can now on Facebook report a post as a false news story. And I think it's interesting that they used the phrase false news story. I also think it's funny that they have it's annoying or not interesting at the top. That's probably just filters out people they don't want to deal with. So you can say it's spam, or you can literally claim that it's false. So it's like I could read a story saying like, my mayor wants to pay trash collectors more money, and if I wanted, I could say, I don't think he's actually going to do that. and then I could report it as a false news story, which is kind of a wild concept, considering, journalists used to kind of be the arbiters of what was a true news story and what isn't, and they still kind of are, although that's deteriorated. But if enough people report a story as false, then it gets fact-checked by one of these official fact-checking organizations. Pointer is like a journalism ethics organization in the US. They assembled a list of, I think, like 20 or 25 organizations that do fact-checking. Sorry, that's like too small to read, but they're not just based in the US. There's one in Argentina I'm familiar with, and a bunch of others. So Facebook will, at some point, let these guys kind of take over, and that's where they're differentiating between false information and like spam, or all sorts of stuff, just like annoying content, or fake news in the sense of stuff you don't agree with, or you think is like overblown or not reported entirely correctly or whatever. So they bring in these fact checkers, and if the fact checkers dispute it, then it'll end up with this little disputing tag. So there's been one study so far that I found, at least. They just implemented this less than a year ago. I kind of forget when but it was like several months ago. And there's been one study that found that if a story pops up with that little disputed tag, disputed by Snopes and the Associated Press, it has, quote, only a very modest impact on users, meaning it doesn't do much. If people want to share that story, they tend to not be deterred by that little disputed tag, and I think it has had very little effect on users. But somewhat more importantly, it does trigger a change in the algorithm that Facebook uses. So if a story ends up with that tag, and Facebook kind of gave into pressure from journalists, and this is why they're doing this. If a story ends up with that tag, then their algorithm makes it harder for it to get shared widely. It basically just doesn't reach as many people as it otherwise would. And then they can also shut off advertising to a Facebook page. They don't do this right away, but if a page gets reported or puts out stories multiple times with a disputed tag, then they'll lose their advertising. So if we go back to the goals of the dumpster fire blogs, that could be one way to actually kind of deter them from spreading misinformation, because their number one goal is advertising money. So fact checking, though, so I just said that fact checking is how to differentiate false information from shitty information. The thing is, journalists have always done that, especially back in the days of newspapers. The newspaper was considered the record of like history, right? Like what was in the newspaper was what happened that day. And journalism has gotten kind of democratized lately with all the digital changes in the last like 10 or 15 years. So it's way, way more common for kind of your average Joe to comment on news stories, create their own news stories, and so on. And that's usually presented as a good thing among journalists. More dialogue with your audience and just kind of more dialogue in general is considered a good thing. I mean, one other effect of it, though, is an erosion of trust in the journalists who do the fact-checking, though. Because what you often see, like the people who disagree with this tag, I mean, I didn't put up an example, but they'll usually say, like, well, Snopes is bullshit. So, like, so now I don't like Facebook as well as Snopes, because now Facebook is, like, working with Snopes. And so if they're dismissing the fact-checkers as bullshit, then you just kind of lost, like you're just never going to get anywhere. Even though fact-checking is kind of the one and only thing that differentiates fake information from real information, false information from real information. So the erosion of trust is one major reason that's happened. Another is scale. And again, both of these are related to the internet pretty obviously. I'm not going to go super in depth on like the development over the past 10 years, because I'm trying to stay focused on what's happening now. But definitely over the last 10 to 15 years, fact checking, which has always been like kind of a cornerstone of journalism, has gotten less and less trusted by people, to put it shortly. One other reason is they basically cannot scale it like the people who put out misinformation can. Like I said, the Macedonian bloggers would just copy and paste and then post it in 16 Facebook groups and like call it a day. Whereas a journalist who is debunking that, would have to spend a lot more time debunking it, and then they wouldn't have the reach that other person had anyway. There's a group called Stop Fake that's based in the Ukraine. And I happened to get an article on this a couple days ago, so I figured I would use them as an example. So there's a study that found, that was trying to judge how useful these fact check and Snopes fact checks were on Facebook. And they found that Stop Fake, which I had not heard of at the time, they found it was more successful in, I'm sorry, I should explain. So what they did was scrape Facebook posts that referenced any one of these three organizations, and then they would judge if it was like a positive or a negative post. So it would be like either like, oh, I'm so glad I have fact check because now I know the truth. Or it would be like, oh, Snopes is bullshit. I can't believe this is on here. Does anyone know why Stop Fake was more successful? Does anyone want to guess? It's based in the Ukraine. Does anyone know what it is? Has anyone even like heard of it? Okay, it might be very localized to Ukraine. So Stop Fake is dedicated to one specific topic, the Ukrainian-Russian conflict that's going on in Ukraine. And so being specific, at least according to this study I read, being specific may be one reason it's more successful. Another one that stuck out to me is that it, you can kind of guess from the fact it's in an English name at all, but it has an audience that it's targeted at, and that audience is the pro-Western Ukrainians, pro-Western anti-Russian. And so if you have a specific topic and a specific audience, as well as like a high demand for it, because there's just so much news and so much kind of conflicting news accounts coming out of that conflict, they did find that Stop Fake was more successful, but I think that's kind of a limited study because they're sending it to a very receptive audience. I imagine if it was read by half like pro-Ukrainian Facebook users and half like pro-Russian Facebook users, it would not be quite as successful. Google does the same thing. They kind of followed on Facebook's heels a little bit. So you can see, it's a small picture, but if you see at the bottom, what they're supposed to be doing is if you look up a news story, they've got the same like fact check tag, where they're trying to pull together fact checks to line up right with the original claim. This is kind of limited. If you use Google News at all, I don't know if anyone has even like seen this. I don't think I've seen it hardly at all, so it's not implemented very widely, clearly. And again, you basically go back to that study saying like, well, it kind of doesn't do anything. Like anyone who looks up this story about 27 million people trapped in modern slavery, at least it seems like they basically don't care what PolitiFact thinks about that story. So they either are in favor of it or not in favor of it, or they are neutral or whatever. They don't change their opinion. So then that's a whole other issue then, is how to get people involved, or how to kind of believing fact checkers, I guess, or changing the whole idea of fact checking. I had this quote up here. Yeah, so as it is right now, and just sort of due to the nature of it, I think journalists still see themselves as like kind of the arbiters or the gatekeepers of truth, where like Donald Trump will say something and then a journalist will be like, no, that's wrong. And journalism has kind of always been that way. There's a lot more misinformation out there now than there used to be, so journalists wouldn't like interject quite as often as they do now. But it's not very popular. Like somebody just kind of showing up and saying like, you're wrong, I'm right, because I'm a journalist, doesn't tend to go over very well. So again, we're going to talk about some other tools that are trying to get around that. Everything is very kind of like topsy-turvy right now, though. So like even the tools that I'm talking about here, they're like, I mean, they're still in development, and people are still trying to figure out even like psychological and like social implications as well as technological and stuff. So it's everything's pretty murky right now, but at least we're kind of becoming more aware of the issues we're dealing with, I think. Okay, so here's a couple examples. If anyone, like I said, if anyone is involved in anything like this or even interested or like has thoughts, feel free to speak up, and I'm also going to take questions or comments later. But these are just a couple of the Knight-funded projects that I think at least have potential. One is called Botometer. It's by a group called Hoaxy. It's like a, I don't know, startup called Hoaxy or something. So they made a tool. I don't know if I can click on this link. Hold on. Sorry. Oh. Hey. Oh, no. Okay. So, never mind. All right. If you're interested, look up these slides and you can actually click on those links. So they made a tool to identify a bot that's not super hard to do. There's probably plenty of tools out there that identify bots. But this falls short of identifying false information because again, you basically need humans to do that. You cannot have a computer identify if something is true or not. Maybe at the most you could have a computer compare like one text against another text. For example, compare a blog post or a political speech against like a journalism news story and say, well, if it doesn't agree with the news story, then it's false. But then that opens, that's clearly not a great solution either. So you need humans involved. So these guys try to find bots, first of all, and then they also track how the news is being shared online. So like here's a story that started in The Onion, which is actually a satirical newspaper in the US. They publish false information that's just supposed to be funny. So it's like news stories that didn't really happen but are like parodying society and whatever. So you can see it was shared by a New York Times reporter, although to be fair to Maggie NYT, she probably did not think it was real. She probably just thought it was funny. But you can see the spread of it, and then you can also see, I'm going to skip for a second. That came out blurry, sorry. But they also identify which are bots in the sense that which are Twitter accounts that are not actual human beings. And so they combine that with their tool to track the spread of it. And they say, okay, if this story is spread by a lot of bots, then at least there's a higher chance that it's false information. Because those are two of the characteristics that often go along with fake information. This is one of the, oh, weird, it got cut off. This is one of the bots I looked up. It's called AmericanNews.com or something. It got cut off, I don't know why. But here they use their algorithm, I guess, to try to judge if it's a bot based on its content and based on the language it uses. And these guys are not open source, but I think these guys are. So unfortunately, these guys are, sorry. So Hoaxy is open source at least. The next guys, mentioned map are not. But so they're trying to isolate the characteristics that usually go along with false information and say like, well, at least that's a clue. But then kind of the issue is right away you come back to the human issue. Like there has to be a human who looks at that Onion story and says like, okay, that's not a real story, because a computer can't do that. So that's bot identification. I mentioned that just kind of jumping in and being like the asshole that's like, no, you're wrong. That doesn't tend to be popular. No surprise. So a lot of, or at least a few people are experimenting with more conversational ways to reach people. It's not just misinformation as well. There's plenty of journalists who are making new apps, chatbots essentially, where they tell you the news, but instead of having it on a passive website, it'll like send you news as messages on WhatsApp, and you can actually text your news bot back and be like, what happened last night, and the news bot will respond. And so you kind of get a more conversational tone, and you also just kind of a new way to consume it and hopefully reach kind of like younger audience members, I guess. So these guys made something called Check for Spam. It has actually been pretty successful in India. Like I said, all these things are so new that I wish I could kind of give you like a case study and say like these guys are working, we should do what these guys are doing. But I mean, everything I'm talking about is like less than a year old. So like these guys seem to be pretty popular. WhatsApp is extremely popular in India, so a lot of false information as well as real information circulates on it. And so they have a WhatsApp chatbot that tries to identify those like rumors or fake info and correct it. These are a couple of the in-person efforts I was talking about. This is actually a course that has been really popular in the US. I don't know if it's kind of spread outside the US, but it's an actual college or a university course that also has their stuff online. And so a lot of journalists I know like it, a lot of just kind of scientists, it's just, I don't know. It's just an in real life thing. It's another Knight funded project. This is another one based in schools and libraries. And then meetups and hackathons. I also do want to give a quick shout out to Hacks Hackers, the group I work for. So we have not actually made an application yet, but we did just get money from Mozilla to do grants for small local misinformation related events. So as opposed to the MisinfoCon grant, which is usually more kind of for like tech development, if you wanted to do like a hackathon, for example, we just had one in Nairobi, we just had one in Rio, there's one in DC coming up in a couple weeks. If you wanted to do like a hackathon or even like a talk, like sponsor a speaker or something, unfortunately we don't have it yet, but like kind of keep in touch with me. MisinfoCon has this calendar of events, of misinformation related events. There's been a huge explosion of them in the last couple of years. So there's actually like a ton going on. Like I said, I've only got 15 minutes left, so I kind of want to pause and ask for questions and stuff. My contact info is here. I'll try to like hang around if anyone wants to talk to me face to face. But I do want to stress, like I know I just talked about journalism, and I don't know if anyone's like super involved in like the journalism industry or like really like cares about it a ton. But there's a ton of like really great product like app development and like open source work going on in this area. So if you're interested, we should talk about it. You could either just like write something, or if you wanted to like maybe get a grant and maybe develop something or even contribute to one of our ongoing projects or something, we should talk about it. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead. Oh, right. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. We have a microphone. So if you do have a question, please wait a sec for the mic to come to you.
Okay, in your honest opinion, having in mind recent developments of AI with Google and Facebook and other major players, do you think that maybe in the future they would like make something like some deep learning AI that will filter out fake or misleading news?
In my honest opinion, I think people will try and fail. In fact, I bet there's like somebody out there who has already tried to make it or made it, but I think that issue is just an issue where you need humans, not computers. I mean, you know, I'm not going to claim that it could never, ever happen for sure, but I think the way that Facebook and Google and WhatsApp even, other people are using their algorithms now, where they try to use humans to identify false information and kind of like downvote it, like keep it down. They use their algorithms in that way. That's, you know, has some potential. And I definitely know journalists who make their own algorithms and stuff and kind of want to get more involved in that. So that's, you know, kind of a developing thing, but at least it's my opinion that that's got to be like a human operated project. Yeah.
Hi. How do you think the fake informations and misleading informations will influence future political campaigns? Will it just alienate more people and drive them away from politics, or how should they react?
Yeah, one reason for the increase in just the sheer amount of misinformation out there is political campaigns. Trump's campaign, for example, put out a lot more misinformation and false claims than other campaigns did. And I'm not just saying that. I mean, it's not just because, like, I want to think that, or people think that, like, just kind of say that off the cuff. I mean, that has definitely been proven that people in political campaigns have put out way more misinformation than they used to. And I think some of that has to do with the erosion of the trust in the media, which means they can get away with it a lot more. They also have their own publication platforms, which they didn't used to do. Like, they didn't used to have their own website, for example. They just kind of had to go through the media. Anyway, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's on the rise, and I think I read somewhere that I think it was like Macedonia, like the same place where some of these guys were working. Like, they had a major issue where a false information story like took hold, and people believed I mean, I didn't put in this presentation because I didn't know enough about it, but it's definitely happening a lot, and I think that has to do with the democratization of communication via the internet. But as for how people will deal with it, I don't know. I mean, I probably shouldn't answer that. I probably shouldn't tell people how to deal with it. I guess it's my own opinion as a journalist, but also just as a person, that, like, you should try to discern real information from not real information. But, a lot of times, especially when we're talking about politics too, it's very wrapped up in, like, emotions and history and social ties and stuff. So I feel like that's not something I can totally speak to. Does that answer your question? Kind of? Sorry, I know. Any others? Yeah.
Hello. You mentioned Ukrainian-based website Stop Fake. So my question would be, how do they substantiate their claims? And of course, the same question can go for Snopes as well, because everything they put on their website is a claim. It's a claim that I can believe in, or as you mentioned, Snopes is shit, right? Somebody will say, I don't believe it. So, and of course, everything that is in a digital form is in the cloud. It's something, it's a bit of, it's all bits and bytes. How do you believe that? Well, you choose to. So right. How do you make it more substantiated?
Yeah, it's interesting that you ask that. I mean, to me, as a journalist, that seems just like a very, very easy issue, to be honest. Like I said, journalists have always fact-checked. I mean, it's just a simple process of finding, maybe like a document that belies what the person said, or like in the case of digital information, if there's like a photo that someone has said was from like the bomb in the London subway a couple days ago, and you can find that photo, that exact same photo published 5 years ago, obviously it's not from the London bombing a couple days ago. So that's an easy example. I mean, okay, so Snopes are not, at least in my mind, Snopes is not journalism. So when journalists fact check, they do what they always do. I mean, they talk to people, but more often you get kind of more firm sources like data or documents, obviously not from biased sources. But then Snopes, I mean, yeah, you're right. Snopes is working with digital information almost exclusively. Like I mentioned that image. So yeah, like technically if they found that image 5 years earlier and from like a bomb in Australia, like technically it might not be from Australia either. But then they're, right, yeah. And, but then there's still more tools. I mean, you can look up that photo's EXIF data. You can, just use like on the ground reporting to determine, is like that building in the background, is that building really, does that building exist in Sydney, Australia, and just like have someone go look at the building and so on. So there's a pretty wide selection of tools that people can use. And then I'm not super familiar with like Snopes or Stop Fakes methodology, but I imagine they kind of just do the same things journalists do. And at least I haven't seen something from them that I would like not trust, I guess. Like if they found a photo and I was like, I don't think that's from Australia either. They could have maybe been duped, but I think they do use like some of the stuff I was talking about to verify it as much as possible. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, over here.
Thank you. I'm interested in if there is any data or research. I'm pretty new and I don't know a lot about it. About the background and the structure of people who do write fake news. How many of them are actually journalists? Real journalists, how many of them are forced to write those news under pressure, maybe? How many of them are not journalists at all? Is there any data on that?
Yeah,
point,
so the first step with collecting data on that is that you go back to the definition of fake news. Like if I tried to make a list of journalists making fake news, I would first have to decide what is fake news and then find the people doing it. So that's a little hard to even get that off the ground. And then people have differing opinions on what fake news is. So like plenty of people think journalists, like mainstream, like even like New York Times journalists make fake news because their definition of fake news is like, like either overblown or like slanted accounts of what happened. And then other people might think fake news is like literally fabricated information. And so, I certainly don't know of any. I guess I wish I did. And then also, thirdly, you kind of would get into like, what's the definition of journalist? Because like Snopes might consider themselves journalists. I don't know. I've never met anyone from Snopes. I would not consider themselves journalists. And so then if you ask like, well, how many of them are journalists? Then actually people have different definitions of a journalist, especially in this day and age with the internet, when like any blogger or person on the street who takes a picture or whatever could call themselves a journalist or be called a journalist. So I guess the answer is no. There's no data on that I know of.
How about the graph you showed about Macedonians and bloggers and miscellaneous other people? Is it somewhere available?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah. So the researcher that I got this from, he scraped Facebook posts on political Facebook groups, and he went through each post by hand, and so that's how he determined like. Oh, sorry, I've got the wrong thing. That's how we determined like who was a blogger and who was living in Macedonia or whatever, and who was not. And so we literally just went to each individual Facebook profile and like hand coded them. Sorry, let me put it back on. There it is. Oh, I was lucky. Okay. What?
I remember it better.
Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah. So.
Do you want to get them? Yeah.
So even though I just wrote the script, I do know a bit more about the researcher's project. He was the business model is they copy the existing news to another. They copy some existing news in order to and change it a little bit so that Google doesn't detect it as a copy. And they hired high school students who knew English to just do the copying. And you could figure this out by the Facebook accounts that they were using. That they would make a bunch of accounts that were of like made up people, but they'd also use their own account because then you just don't have to make another account. So in that particular instance, it's like in this case it was pretty obvious. He went through it for like many days and figured this out, but it's not like a procedure that you can like usefully replicate in order to come up with the sort of statistics you're thinking of.
With that data, you can always cross-reference it with possessing that data. of all those Facebook posts, you can always cross-reference it to the people who posted them. And you can always match them with people who you know they are famous journalists, and the other ones miscellaneous.
Right. Oh, sorry. Is this mine? Yeah, that's true. I guess I wanted to emphasize that the researcher did code these by hand, and you can see there's several hundred posts. So there's not a whole lot of people out there who want to sift through like tens of thousands of Facebook posts and personally identify all the people posting them. But that is kind of one way to do it. Christina, could you maybe grab the mic because you had something you wanted to, a project you wanted to talk about? And I know we only have a couple more minutes, so we can maybe do one more question after Christina, but then I think we got to clear out of here.
Yeah, but I participate to a project that is Tails. I don't know if some of you know this distro. Is something not about the misinformation or these things, but is to protect journalists. It's for it's a Linux-based, Debian-based distro, and with a lot of programs with a lot of programs for good encryption, and all the web traffic pass for Tor. And so it's a good tool for journalists, for activists, and for people that manage sensitive documents. And to understand us is the distro that Laura Poitras used in 2014 to contact Snowden. And so it's a tool that lucky works. And I contribute in the translation because also the localization of the documentation is really important, so became a easier tool to use for a journalist. And if someone of you wants to contribute for translation, can ask to me that I have the Tails t-shirt and it's easy. Thanks.
So I think we're kind of at end time. Does anyone have any like last minute questions or any like project you're working on or anything you want to share? Yeah.
Okay, I was thinking about the war on fake news, and okay, we can do fact checking, but this obviously doesn't scale. It's much easier and much less work to put on a fake news story on the web than to take it down or to fact check it. We can cut the money streams, of course, like you mentioned. But maybe we could start educating people maybe more even, back in the 90s when I started with the internet, we had like the vision that the internet will democratize knowledge and everyone gets the same state of knowledge, and it will be a new era of enlightenment. At the end, confirmation bias and filter bubbles prevailed and were succeeded above this vision. So I don't know, maybe do you have any ideas how we could promote more critical thinking with people, or do more education, or I don't know, but
yeah. So one of the main one of the main components of the Mozilla Information Trust Initiative is web literacy, and web literacy is much bigger than the issue of misinformation. It's much bigger than just differentiating credible information from non-credible. So that's something they've been working on for a while. But like I said, they do like in-person courses, like a few of them that I mentioned. And then they also do online courses and stuff. And so they're definitely trying to promote critical thinking, and also an awareness of like how the web works. For example, if something is shared 1 million times, that doesn't mean it's true or whatever. And so, that's been going on since before Mozilla was so interested in misinformation. But I think that's definitely a really, really big uphill battle, as is kind of everything else I just talked about. calling bullshit, which is this online course, well, in person and online course I talked about. I mean, what they're basically just teaching is how to tell the difference between, credible and non-credible information, which you would think is like a very, very basic skill, and they're teaching it at university. And I think they, even above the university level. So I don't know if that is like a skill, like a critical thinking skill that like society has like lost over the course of time or something. I mean, I definitely don't know if that has really happened or if we just have more interest in like having that skill now. But there definitely are people trying to teach it. The other one was this one that's being taught in like libraries and public schools and stuff. But, if you have a class of like 30 people at a public library, like hopefully you taught those 30 people something really useful, but it's only 30 people, And so it's kind of taking things very slowly, but I don't know if people really have, well, and then there are technological versions as well, like apps that teach you news literacy and stuff. But again, it's like, I think even that is hard to scale, because even if you teach like several dozen people to think more critically about what they read, like that's still just several dozen people compared to all the people who saw the misinformation. Okay, any last questions? And I'll be around if anyone does want to keep talking or whatever, or didn't get a chance. Tom, yeah, up in front. I think Tom in the pink pants.
There really is time or no? No? Okay, I'll leave this as a comment rather than a question. I propose that since much of the issue apparently is advertising revenue motivates this stuff, assuming it is like a problem that people are sharing this, that like people believe it or something. Advertising revenue maybe motivates it. So simply by using decentralized services and establishing a network of trust, rather than using the Web 2.0 websites, we might have already figured this out. Maybe. If you just like don't use like Facebook and stuff, maybe this is like much less of an issue. So it might be like much less of an issue to the people in this room than like other people. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it could be. I mean, social media is definitely one of the main reasons they spread so much, and that's often because social media has like the same goals as the actual misinformation spreaders. So not that they're like in cahoots, but they're maybe not as interested in like restraining this content as journalists are. Okay, so I'm gonna cut it off there, but I'm gonna be around all night and stuff if anyone has questions or whatever or wants to talk to me about MisinfoCon. Thank you guys.